The hands came first. That was always how it started. Before the sound, before the fire, before the screaming that turned the desert night into something no human voice should ever have to carry. The hands came first. They were small hands. A woman's hands. Covered in blood so dark it looked black under the Afghan sky. Pressing down hard against a wound that refused to stop bleeding. Fingers trembling not from fear, but from the sheer force of trying to hold a man's life inside his body, while the world around them tore itself apart. A radio crackled somewhere behind her. Static. Then a voice sharp and commanding cutting through the noise like a blade through smoke. Angel 6, fall back. Extraction in 90 seconds. But the woman didn't move. She pressed harder. The man underneath her hands let out a sound that wasn't quite a word, and the dog beside him, a German shepherd with dust caked into its fur, and panic in its dark eyes, pushed its nose against the man's face like it was trying to wake him from a sleep he wasn't supposed to be falling into. Angel 6, confirm. Fall back now. The woman's jaw tightened. Her lips moved, but whatever she said was swallowed by the explosion that lit up the ridgeline 200 meters south. Sand and heat and noise folded over the medical tent like a wave breaking against rock. And then, just like every other time this memory played itself out in the dark theater behind her closed eyes, everything went white. Then silence. Then a parking lot. The sun hadn't cleared the tree line yet when Wren Calloway opened her eyes and realized she was gripping the steering wheel of her car hard enough to leave marks in her palms. She exhaled slowly through her nose, the kind of breath that sounds controlled but isn't, and loosened her fingers one by one until the leather creaked softly under her hands. The dashboard clock read 6:47. She had been sitting in the parking lot of the Pinewood Diner for 11 minutes. Same as yesterday. Same as the day before that. Same as every morning for the past 2 years, give or take the handful of days she called in sick because the nightmares had been bad enough to keep her in bed past noon. She didn't call them nightmares, though. Not out loud. Not even to herself. She called them echoes because that sounded like something that would eventually fade. Something that would lose its shape and its volume the further it traveled from the source. But echoes were supposed to get quieter over time. These hadn't. If anything, they had grown sharper, more detailed, as if distance didn't diminish them, but refined them, stripping away everything that wasn't essential, until only the worst parts remained. The hands, the blood, the voice on the radio, the silence that came after. Every therapist at this VA hospital had told her the same thing. Talk about it. Name it. Give it shape so it stops shaping you. She had gone to 3 appointments before deciding that the people asking her to talk about it had never been in a place where talking was the last thing that kept you alive. She stopped going. She stopped answering their calls. And eventually, the calls stopped coming. Wren tilted the rearview mirror toward her face and studied the woman looking back at her. 31 years old. Brown hair pulled into a low ponytail. No makeup. Slight shadows under her eyes that could pass for tiredness or could pass for something heavier depending on who was looking. She wore a plain gray t-shirt under a faded denim jacket, and the sleeves of both were pulled down past her wrists, just the way she always wore them, even in the summer. Even when the heat in the diner turned the air behind the counter into something thick enough to swim through. She pulled the left sleeve down a little further, checking. The scar was still hidden. Good. It wasn't a large scar. Just a thin line, maybe 3 inches long, running along the inside of her left wrist, where the skin was soft and pale. To a doctor, it might look like a surgical mark. To a civilian, it might not look like anything at all. But to someone who had spent time in combat medicine, someone who knew what a field tourniquet looked like after it had been cinched down tight enough to cut off blood flow to a shattered forearm in the back of a moving vehicle while rounds struck the armor plating 6 inches from your head. That scar told a very specific story. Wren didn't want anyone reading that story. Not here, not ever. She stepped out of the car, locked it with a quiet click, and walked across the gravel lot toward the diner's front door. The morning air smelled like pine and bacon grease, which meant Hank had already fired up the grill inside. Good. A busy morning meant less time to think. The Pinewood Diner sat just off Route 9 in a part of rural Virginia, where the towns were small enough to have one traffic light and the kind of pride that came from being close to something important without actually being important themselves. Fort Belvoir was 40 minutes east. Quantico was an hour south. The diner drew its breakfast crowd from construction crews, long-haul truckers, weekend hunters, and the occasional family passing through on the way to somewhere more interesting. The building itself looked like it had been built in the early 1970s and hadn't been remodeled since the late 1990s. Brown brick exterior. A flat roof with a Coca-Cola sign bolted to the side that buzzed faintly at night. Inside, the floor was beige tile cracked in 3 places near the kitchen, and patched with grout that didn't quite match. The booths were upholstered in maroon vinyl that had faded to something closer to the color of dried roses. The counter was formica, the stools chrome and cushioned, and the whole place smelled permanently of bacon grease, burnt coffee, and the faint chemical sweetness of industrial floor cleaner. It was not a beautiful place, but it was honest. Every scratch on the counter and every stain on the ceiling told the truth about what this building was. A place where ordinary people came to eat ordinary food and sit with their ordinary problems for an hour before going back to the work of being alive. It was the kind of place where people came to eat fast and leave without looking too hard at anything, which was exactly why Ren had chosen it. She pushed through the front door at 6:52, and the familiar bell above the frame announced her arrival to no one in particular. The diner was already half full. Hank Prescott stood behind the register, a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a gray mustache and hands that always smelled like dish soap counting the morning's float, with the slow patience of someone who had been running the same diner for 23 years and had stopped being in a hurry about anything. He looked up when Ren walked in. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied. That was the extent of their daily greeting, and it had been for 2 years. Hank had hired Ren in the spring of 2023, after she walked in one Tuesday afternoon, asked if he was hiring, and filled out the application in handwriting so neat it looked like it had been done with a ruler. She listed no previous employment, no references, no emergency contact. Hank had looked at the application for a long time. Then he looked at Ren standing in front of him with her sleeves pulled down and her posture straighter than any waitress he had ever interviewed, and he asked one question. "Can you start Thursday?" He never asked about the gaps. He never asked why a woman in her late 20s with no work history and no local connections wanted to pour coffee in a roadside diner in the middle of nowhere. He had a feeling about it, the kind of feeling a man develops after decades of watching people walk through his door carrying things they don't want to talk about. And Hank Prescott had always believed that a person's past was their own business until they decided otherwise. Ren tied her apron, grabbed the coffee pot, and started her rounds. The breakfast crowd at Pinewood was predictable. The construction crew from the new housing development sat in the big booth near the window. 4 men in reflective vests arguing about whether the Commanders had any shot at the playoffs this year. 2 truckers occupied the counter stools nearest the door, eating silently, the way men eat when they have been driving since 3 in the morning and haven't yet decided whether the day ahead of them is going to be tolerable. A young couple sat in a booth near the back sharing a plate of pancakes and looking at their phones instead of each other. And in the corner booth, the one nearest the kitchen and furthest from the window, sat Merle Ashford. Merle was 61 years old, though he looked like a man who had been 61 for at least a decade. He had the kind of face that seemed permanently fixed somewhere between patience and exhaustion. Deep lines around his mouth, pale blue eyes that moved slowly but missed very little, and a gray stubble that he shaved every 3rd day whether it needed it or not. He wore the same thing he always wore, a plaid flannel shirt, dark work pants, and a faded olive baseball cap, with the words "Desert Storm Veteran" stitched across the front, in thread that had once been gold, but had long since dulled to a tired yellow. Merle came to the Pinewood every morning at 6:30. He ordered black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, and wheat toast. He sat in the same corner booth. He read the same newspaper even though half the time he just stared at the same page for 20 minutes without turning it. And he watched the room. That was the thing about Merle that most people never noticed. He watched everything. The way a hunter watches a tree line, not looking for anything specific, just making sure nothing moves that shouldn't. Ren brought him his coffee without being asked. She set it down gently the way she always did, and Merle gave a small nod without looking up from his paper. "Thank you, Ren." "You're welcome, Merle." Another routine, another morning, another day of moving through the world like a woman who had nothing unusual about her, nothing hidden, nothing worth asking about. Ren poured refills for the truckers, took an order from the couple in the back, and let the rhythm of the work carry her forward the way it always did. One table at a time, one coffee pot at a time, one breath at a time. If anyone had been watching her closely that morning, truly closely, the way a trained observer watches a subject who doesn't know they're being studied, they might have noticed a few things. They might have noticed the way she moved through the crowded diner without ever bumping into a chair or brushing against a customer's arm. Her steps were precise and measured, each one placed with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to move through tight spaces without disturbing anything around her. Her posture remained straight, even after an hour on her feet, shoulders back, chin level, a bearing that looked natural until you realized how few civilians actually carried themselves that way. They might have noticed the way her eyes moved, not the casual scanning of a busy waitress checking which tables needed attention. Something sharper. Her gaze swept the room in quick, efficient arcs, pausing briefly on each entry point, the front door, the kitchen doorway, the hallway leading to the restrooms, before returning to whatever was directly in front of her. It was the kind of room awareness that doesn't come from working in restaurants. It comes from working in places where knowing your exits could be the difference between walking out and being carried out. And they might have noticed what happened at 7:14, when a glass of orange juice slipped from the hand of one of the construction workers at the window booth and shattered on the tile floor. The crash was sudden, loud, and sharp. Every head in the diner turned toward the sound, but Ren had already turned. Not after the glass hit the floor. Before. In the fraction of a second between the glass leaving the man's fingers and the moment it struck the tile, Ren's body had already shifted. Her shoulders squared. Her weight dropped slightly into her heels. Her right hand moved 2 inches toward her hip before stopping and returning to the coffee pot she was holding. The entire reaction lasted less than a second. Nobody in the diner noticed it. Nobody except Merle Ashford, who looked up from his newspaper just long enough to watch Ren's hand return to the coffee pot, and then went back to reading without saying a word. By 7:30, the diner had settled into its familiar mid-morning rhythm. The construction crew paid their bill and left in a cloud of aftershave and sawdust. The truckers finished their eggs and walked back to their rigs without tipping as usual. The young couple in the back ordered more coffee and continued ignoring each other. Ren moved behind the counter, refilling napkin dispensers and organizing the stack of menus that never stayed organized for more than an hour. The morning was shaping up to be ordinary, predictable, safe. And then the door opened. The bell above the frame rang the same way it always did. A small bright sound that usually disappeared into the noise of the room within half a second. But this time, the noise of the room began to disappear instead. Conversations didn't stop. They dimmed, like someone had slowly turned down the volume on the entire diner. The man standing in the doorway was tall, though the metal crutch under his right arm made it difficult to tell exactly how tall. He wore a dark canvas jacket, the kind that had been washed enough times to go soft at the collar, but still held its shape through the shoulders. Beneath it, a plain black t-shirt. His face was tanned and weathered in the way that comes from years of being outdoors in places where the sun isn't gentle, and his dark hair was cropped short in a style that hadn't changed since the day he first sat down in a military barber's chair. His name was Coulter Reed. He was 40 years old, though the lines around his eyes and the gray creeping into his temples suggested a man who had lived more years than the calendar was willing to count. He stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior of the diner, and in that stillness, the people inside got their first clear look at him. What they saw first was the crutch. What they saw second was the reason for the crutch. His right pant leg was folded neatly and pinned just above the knee, the fabric tucked with a precision that spoke of long practice. The absence was clean, the kind of clean that comes from a wound treated in a proper surgical theater rather than a field hospital. Though the road between the two had almost certainly been long and terrible. What they saw third was the dog. A German shepherd stood at Coulter's left side, its dark fur clean and brushed. Those streaks of silver had crept across its muzzle and above its eyes the way age creeps across the face of any creature that has lived long enough to earn it. The dog was old for its breed, 11 years at least, and its movements carried the careful economy of an animal that had learned to conserve energy without sacrificing alertness. Its posture was rigid with the kind of discipline that has nothing to do with obedience school and everything to do with thousands of hours of specialized military training. The dog wore a fitted vest with a small rectangular patch on the left side. The patch read, "Military K9 Do Not Pet" in white letters against a black background. The dog's name was Coda, and Coda was watching the room the same way the room was watching him. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Coulter simply stood in the doorway, scanning the diner the way any tired traveler would scan a crowded restaurant on a busy morning, looking for a seat, looking for space, looking for the small, simple mercy of a place to sit down and eat breakfast without having to explain himself. The diner was nearly full, but there were empty seats, open spaces at tables where 1 or 2 more people could easily fit. Coulter spotted the nearest option and moved toward it. The first table was occupied by 2 middle-aged men finishing their coffee near the center of the room. One wore a plumbing company polo. The other had the thick hands and sunburned neck of someone who worked outdoors. Their plates were nearly empty. Their jackets were already draped over the backs of their chairs. They were clearly about to leave. Coulter stopped beside their table and shifted his weight onto the crutch. His voice was calm, polite, and carried the unhurried cadence of a man who had long ago stopped expecting things to be easy. "Excuse me, mind if I sit here?" The two men looked at each other. It was a short look, barely half a second, the kind of silent communication that happens between people who have already decided something but need confirmation before saying it out loud. The man in the plumbing polo cleared his throat. "Sorry, pal. We're waiting for someone." They weren't. Everything about the table said they were finished. But Coulter didn't argue. He nodded once the way someone nods when they've heard the answer before and moved on. The next table was a booth where a young couple sat across from each other. The man saw Coulter approaching and immediately slid toward the center of the bench, closing the gap where someone might have sat. He picked up his phone and stared at it with the kind of intensity usually reserved for emergency notifications. The woman beside him offered a tight-lipped smile that managed to be both polite and closed at the same time. Coulter didn't even have to ask. The message was clear. At the next table, a family of four. The mother instinctively placed her hand on her youngest child's shoulder and angled her body slightly between the child and the approaching stranger. The father looked up from his plate, chewing slowly, and shook his head before Coulter could speak. "We need the whole table." Sorry, they didn't need the whole table. There were 2 empty chairs. But the math of discomfort had already been calculated, and the answer had come out the same way it always did. Coulter moved on. At each table, the scene repeated itself with minor variations. A cleared throat, an averted gaze, a sudden need for more space. One man near the window actually pulled his chair closer to the table as Coulter approached, tucking it in, like he was trying to make the empty seat beside him physically disappear. Nobody was cruel about it. Nobody said anything openly unkind. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of rejection that operates through small gestures and half-excuses, the kind that lets people convince themselves they haven't really turned anyone away because they never actually said no. They just made yes impossible. There was something deeply American about the way it happened. Not the loud confrontational kind of prejudice that makes the evening news and gets people fired from their jobs. The other kind. The kind that lives in the space between what people say and what they do. The kind that smiles while it closes the door. The kind that says sorry and means please go away, and never has to reconcile the difference because nobody in the room is willing to say what everyone already knows. A man in a worn trucker cap near the register shook his head slowly as he watched Coulter move from table to table. Not at Coulter. At the room. At the quiet, coordinated performance of discomfort being staged by a dozen people who would all describe themselves as good, decent, patriotic Americans if you asked them over a beer. The man in the trucker cap looked like he wanted to say something. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, and went back to stirring his coffee with the kind of intensity that suggested the coffee had personally wronged him. These were people who put yellow ribbon magnets on their trucks. People who stood for the anthem at football games and got misty-eyed during 4th of July flyovers. People who would shake a veteran's hand at an airport and tell him they were grateful for his service and genuinely mean it in the moment. But meaning it in the moment was different from making room. And making room was the one thing nobody in that diner was willing to do. Coulter absorbed each refusal the same way. A small nod, a quiet shift of weight on the crutch, then forward to the next table with the steady patience of a man who had once walked through places far more hostile than a roadside diner and had learned that the only thing worse than being turned away was letting it change the way you carried yourself. Coda stayed at his side through all of it. The dog moved with Coulter like a shadow, each step calibrated to match the rhythm of the crutch, never pulling ahead, never falling behind. But the dog's eyes were doing something different than its handlers. While Coulter kept his gaze forward, focused on the next table, Coda's dark eyes swept across the faces of every person who looked away. The dog studied them with the calm, unblinking focus of an animal that had been trained to assess threats and had learned that the most dangerous things in any room were rarely the loudest. From the corner booth, Merle Ashford watched the entire scene unfold. His newspaper sat open on the table in front of him, but his eyes had stopped reading the moment Coulter walked through the door. His right hand rested beside his coffee mug, the fingers slightly curled, and the old veteran's jaw tightened incrementally with each table that turned the younger man away. Merle recognized the crutch. He recognized the folded pant leg. He recognized the bearing and the quiet discipline of the dog at the man's side. And he recognized something else too. Something that sat deeper than the visible wounds. He recognized the look on Coulter's face. The careful blankness of a man who had decided a long time ago that other people's discomfort was not his responsibility to fix. Merle had worn that same expression for most of the 1990s. Behind the counter, Wren had seen everything. She had watched Coulter enter the diner from the moment the bell rang. She had tracked his movement through the room the way she tracked everything in quick, quiet glances that looked casual, but covered every angle. She had noted the crutch, the folded pant leg, the jacket, the posture. She had seen the trained stillness in his shoulders, and the careful way he distributed his weight so the crutch barely made a sound against the floor. And she had noticed the dog. Not just noticed it, recognized it. Not the specific animal, but the type. The way Coda walked, the controlled precision of each step. The rigid posture, the vest, the constant scanning of the environment. Those were not the signs of a standard service dog trained to open doors and retrieve dropped items. Those were the hallmarks of a military working dog, a K9 that had been trained in detection patrol and combat support. A dog that had been deployed to the same kinds of places that left men with folded pant legs and metal crutches. Wren felt something shift in the back of her mind. Not a memory exactly, more like the shadow of one. A familiar tension that rose from somewhere deep in her chest and settled behind her eyes like a headache that hadn't quite arrived yet. She pushed it down the way she always did, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been pushing things down for 9 years. She watched Coulter reach the last occupied table near the far wall and receive the same quiet refusal he had received at every other table. She watched him nod. She watched him shift his weight. And she watched him look around the diner one final time, searching for a seat that didn't exist, while every person in the room found somewhere else to put their eyes. Something turned over in Wren's chest. Not pity. She had learned a long time ago that pity was useless, a feeling that made the person feeling it think they had done something when they hadn't done anything at all. This was something else. This was recognition. The bone-deep understanding of what it felt like to walk into a room full of people and realize that none of them wanted you there. She looked down at the coffee pot in her hand. She looked at the empty stool at the counter, the one nearest the kitchen doorway that customers rarely chose because it sat too close to the heat coming off the grill. Then she looked up. "Sir," her voice carried easily across the diner. Not loud, just clear. The kind of clarity that comes from years of being heard in places where background noise was gunfire instead of clattering plates. Coulter turned towards the sound. Wren pulled the empty stool out from the counter with one hand and gave a small nod. The gesture was simple, ordinary. The kind of thing a waitress might do a dozen times during a busy morning. "You can sit here if you'd like." For the first time since walking into the diner, something changed in Coulter's face. The careful blankness softened. Not much, just enough for a person who was paying attention to notice the brief flicker of relief that passed through his eyes before he brought the mask back into place. He moved toward the counter with the slow deliberation of a man navigating a space that wasn't built for crutches. Each step was calculated, each placement of the metal tip precise, the rubber foot finding its grip on the tile floor with quiet certainty. When he reached the stool, he positioned the crutch against the counter's edge, placed both hands on the seat, and lowered himself down with the controlled strength of someone whose upper body had learned to compensate for what the lower body could no longer do. Coda settled on the floor beside him without needing a command. The dog folded into a compact resting position, head up, ears relaxed, eyes still sweeping the room in slow, methodical passes. A soldier at ease, alert but not alarmed. The diner exhaled. Conversations that had been held at a whisper slowly returned to normal volume. Forks scraped against plates again. Someone coughed. The television mounted above the register continued playing the morning news to an audience that had stopped watching it 10 minutes ago. Wren poured a cup of coffee and placed it in front of Coulter. The mug was white, slightly chipped on one side, and filled exactly 3/4 full, the way she poured every cup, leaving room for cream that most of her customers never added. "Cream or sugar?" she asked. "Black is fine, thank you." The exchange was ordinary, forgettable. The kind of two-sentence interaction that happens 1,000 times a day in diners across America without anyone remembering it an hour later. Wren turned to refill another customer's mug 2 stools down. She lifted the pot, tilted it at the practiced angle that prevented dripping, and began to pour. And that was when Coda froze. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't whine or shift or make any sound at all. One moment Coda was lying in a relaxed position beside Coulter's stool, and the next every muscle in the animal's body locked into perfect stillness. The transition was instantaneous, like a switch being thrown. Coda's ears rose sharply. The dog's head turned with mechanical precision until its dark eyes were aimed directly at Wren. Not at the coffee pot, not at the counter, not at the customers nearby. At Wren. Specifically, precisely, unmistakably at her. Then slowly Coda stood, The movement was controlled and deliberate. No sudden lunge, no scramble to get up. The dog simply rose from the floor and took 3 measured steps toward Ren until it was standing directly in front of her. Then, Coda sat, perfectly upright, perfectly still. Eyes locked on the waitress's face with an intensity that made the air around the counter feel suddenly heavier. The diner noticed, not all at once. It spread like a ripple across still water. The customer 2 stools down stopped mid-sip and stared at the dog. The couple in the back booth leaned forward slightly. One of the remaining construction workers near the window turned his head and nudged his companion. Within 15 seconds, nearly every person in the Pinewood diner was watching the German Shepherd sitting at attention in front of a waitress who was still holding a coffee pot. Coulter stared at his dog. The confusion on his face arrived slowly like weather changing, replacing the calm expression he had worn since walking through the door. He knew this behavior. He knew exactly what it meant. And he knew it didn't happen by accident. Military K-9s were trained to respond to specific stimuli, specific scents, specific behavioral patterns, specific environmental cues that civilian dogs would never notice and civilian people would never think to look for. Coda had spent years working alongside combat handlers and military medical personnel. The dog had been deployed to 3 different theaters of operation. It had detected explosives, tracked wounded soldiers, and guided rescue teams through terrain that would have been impassable without a trained nose. In all the years since leaving active service, Coda had never once reacted to a civilian the way it was reacting to the woman standing behind the counter of a Virginia diner, holding a pot of coffee. Coulter leaned down slightly and placed a calm hand on the dog's harness. "Coda," he said softly. The command was subtle, barely above a whisper, the kind of quiet reset signal a trained handler uses to break a dog's focus and redirect its attention. Coda didn't move. The dog's eyes stayed fixed on Ren. Its ears remained forward. Its posture remained locked in the rigid, attentive stance of an animal that had identified something it considered important and had no intention of looking away until it understood what that something was. Ren stood very still. The coffee pot remained in her right hand, tilted slightly, the last drops of the pour still clinging to the lip of the spout. Her face showed nothing. Not surprise, not confusion, not fear. Just the careful, practiced emptiness of someone who had learned a long time ago that the safest thing you could do, in an unexpected situation, was control exactly how much of yourself you allowed other people to see. But beneath that surface, behind the calm eyes and the steady hands, and the unremarkable expression of a woman pouring coffee on a Tuesday morning, something was happening. Something quiet, something seismic. Because Ren recognized the behavior too. She recognized the rigid posture, the locked gaze, the absolute stillness. She recognized the way Coda's nose twitched slightly, processing scent data with the speed and precision of an animal that had been taught to read the chemical language of human bodies the way other dogs read fire hydrants. She recognized all of it because she had seen it before. Many times. In places that smelled like antiseptic and gun oil and blood-soaked sand. She knew what that posture meant. She knew what the dog was doing. And she knew with the certainty that settled in her stomach like a cold stone that the German Shepherd sitting in front of her had just identified something about her that she had spent 9 years making sure nobody in this diner or anywhere else would ever find out. For a long suspended moment, Ren and the dog stared at each other. The diner had gone fully quiet now. Even the television seemed to have lowered its volume, though no one had touched the remote. The hiss of the grill in the kitchen was the only sound, and even that seemed distant. Ren made a decision. She set the coffee pot down gently on the counter. She picked up a small towel and wiped a section of countertop that was already clean. She turned to Coulter with an expression of mild amusement, the kind of expression a waitress puts on when something unusual happens during a shift, but doesn't warrant anything more than a polite acknowledgement. "Friendly dog," she said lightly. Her voice was steady, controlled. If her heart was beating faster than normal, and it was nothing in her face or her posture or the rhythm of her words gave it away. She had spent years learning how to separate what she felt from what she showed, and that skill had never failed her. Until now, it hadn't needed to be tested by a German Shepherd who could smell the truth. Coulter was still watching Coda. The confusion on his face had deepened into something more focused, more deliberate. He wasn't just puzzled by the dog's behavior. He was reading it. The way a man reads a map when he suspects the terrain ahead is about to change. He looked up from the dog and met Ren's eyes. The question came quietly, almost gently, like a hand testing the surface of water before reaching in. "Ma'am, have we met before?" Ren held his gaze for exactly the right amount of time. Not too short, which would suggest she was avoiding the question. Not too long, which would suggest she was deciding how to answer it. She gave him a small shrug, the kind that carries nothing heavier than mild curiosity, and shook her head. "I don't think so," she said. "I've worked here a long time, though. Maybe you passed through before." It was a reasonable answer, an ordinary answer, the kind of answer that should have ended the conversation and allowed the morning to continue uninterrupted. But Coda was still sitting in front of her, and Coulter Reed was still watching her face the way a man watches something he can't quite bring himself to look away from. And in the corner booth, Merle Ashford slowly lowered his newspaper and fixed his pale blue eyes on the scene unfolding at the counter. He studied the dog. He studied the waitress. He studied the distance between them and the silence that filled it. Then he set the newspaper down entirely and folded his hands on the table in front of him the way a man does when he has decided to stop pretending he isn't paying attention. Because Merle had been watching Wren Calloway for 2 years. He had watched her move through the diner with that quiet precision. He had watched her flinch at loud sounds and recover so fast that nobody noticed the flinch. He had watched her scan rooms and check exits and carry herself with a discipline that didn't come from serving pancakes. He had never said a word about any of it, because Merle Ashford understood in the deep and permanent way that only a man who has carried his own silence for 30 years can understand that some people need their secrets the way other people need air. But watching the military K-9 sit at attention in front of the woman he had quietly suspected for 2 years of being something far more than a waitress, Merle felt a slow, heavy certainty settle into his chest. Whatever Wren Calloway had been hiding was about to come into the light, and the old soldier in the corner booth wasn't sure whether that was going to save her or break her apart. The silence at the counter lasted 4 seconds, maybe 5. In a diner full of people eating breakfast and pretending not to stare, 4 seconds of silence between a waitress and a stranger might as well have been an hour. But Wren was already moving again, and the moment she moved, the spell wavered just enough for the room to start breathing again. She grabbed a small notepad from beside the register and clicked her pen. The motion was automatic, the kind of muscle memory that takes over when the conscious mind needs a moment to regroup. "What can I get you for breakfast?" she asked. Her voice carried exactly the right amount of warmth, not too much which would feel forced. Not too little which would confirm the tension that was already building between them. Coulter studied her for 1 more second before answering. Then he picked up the laminated menu, glanced at it the way a man glances at something he has already decided about, and set it back down. "Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, coffee's good." Simple food. The kind of order a man places when eating isn't the point, when the meal is just something to do, while the real work happens inside his head. Wren wrote it down without comment and turned toward the kitchen window to clip the ticket to the order wheel. As she walked away, she felt it, the weight of the dog's attention following her. Not threatening, not aggressive, just there, constant, like a searchlight that had locked onto its target and would not be redirected. She clipped the order and spoke through the window. "2 scrambled wheat, Hank." Hank glanced up from the grill, read the ticket, and gave a short nod. But his eyes lingered on Wren's face half a second longer than usual. He had been watching the scene from the kitchen, catching fragments through the service window. The dog. The silence. The way Wren had handled the moment with the steady calm of someone diffusing a situation that nobody else in the room even realized was a situation. Hank didn't ask. He just cracked 2 eggs onto the grill and turned back to his work. Wren returned to the counter and began the small repetitive tasks that kept the diner running during a morning shift. She refilled the sugar dispensers. She restacked the paper napkin holders. She wiped down the section of counter between Coulter and the next customer, even though it was clean. But the entire time she worked, she was aware of Coda. The dog had shifted its position slightly, turning its body so it could track Wren's movement along the full length of the counter without having to turn its head. The animal's eyes followed her with the calm, patient focus of a predator that had already caught its prey and was simply waiting for the right moment to close the distance. No, not a predator. Something else. Something Wren recognized from a different life, from nights when she had knelt beside wounded men in the dirt and felt the press of warm fur against her arm while she worked. Something protective, something loyal, something that remembered. Coulter was watching too. Not the dog this time. He was watching the way Wren moved behind the counter, the way she turned her shoulders to keep the entire room in her peripheral vision, the way she positioned herself near the kitchen doorway close to the exit, the way someone does when leaving quickly might someday be necessary. The way her steps fell almost silently on the tile floor. Each footfall placed with the kind of deliberate control that most people associate with dancers or hunters or soldiers. He stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon making small, quiet circles in the dark liquid. His mind was working through the information the way it had been trained to work through intelligence briefs and mission reports. Data point by data point. Detail by detail. The dog's reaction, the woman's posture, the precision of her movement, the way she had recognized the K9's behavior before he had. That last detail was the one he kept returning to. When Coda had stood and approached her, most civilians would have stepped back. Most civilians would have shown surprise or nervousness, or at the very least the instinctive tension that comes from having a large unfamiliar dog suddenly focus all its attention on you. Ren had done none of those things. She had stood perfectly still, assessed the situation, and then calmly redirected the conversation as if nothing unusual had happened. That was not a civilian reaction. That was a trained response. The kitchen bell rang. Hank slid the plate of scrambled eggs and wheat toast onto the counter. Ren picked it up and carried it to Coulter, setting it down beside his coffee with the practiced ease of a woman who had delivered 10,000 plates to 10,000 customers and could do it in her sleep. But as she leaned forward to place the plate, her left sleeve shifted. Just slightly, just enough. Coulter saw it, the thin line of scar tissue running along the inside of her wrist, disappearing beneath the fabric of her sleeve. It was visible for less than 2 seconds before gravity pulled the fabric back into place. Most people would never have noticed it. Most people wouldn't have known what they were looking at even if they had. But Coulter Reed had spent 12 years in the United States Navy. He had served alongside combat medics in 4 different countries. He had seen that kind of scar before, on the arms of men and women who had applied emergency tourniquets to themselves or to others in conditions so extreme that precision was impossible, and survival was measured in seconds. That mark on Ren's wrist was not a surgical scar. It was not a kitchen accident. It was not the result of anything that happened in a diner, or an apartment, or an ordinary life. That scar had been made in the field, under fire, by someone who knew exactly what a tourniquet was supposed to do and had needed one badly enough to leave a permanent mark. Coulter looked at the scar. Then he looked at Ren's face, and in that brief moment of eye contact, something passed between them that neither of them acknowledged out loud. A recognition, a question. A door that had been sealed shut for years now trembling on its hinges. Ren pulled her sleeve down. The motion was quick, automatic, the kind of thing a person does 100 times a day without thinking about it. But this time, there was something almost fierce about it, a sharpness in the way her fingers tugged the fabric into place, as if she were locking a door that someone had just tried to open. She stepped back from the counter. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said. The words were standard, rehearsed, the same sentence she delivered to every customer at the end of every order. But her voice had changed. Not much. Just a fraction of a degree. A tightness that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago pulled taut across the back of her throat like a wire under tension. Coulter picked up his fork. He looked at the plate in front of him. He looked at the dog still sitting attentive at Ren's feet. And he made a decision that he hadn't planned to make when he walked into this diner looking for nothing more than a cup of coffee and a place to sit. He decided to stay. Not because the eggs looked good. Not because the coffee was fresh. But because everything about this woman, her posture, her reflexes, her scar, and the way his dead friend's dog was responding to her was telling him something that his mind hadn't fully assembled yet, but his instincts already understood. There was a story here. A real one. And it was hiding behind the counter of a roadside diner in Virginia, wearing an apron and pulling down its sleeves. Coulter took a bite of eggs and chewed slowly, giving the moment time to breathe. He would not rush this. He had learned patience in places where rushing got people killed. He would eat his breakfast. He would drink his coffee. He would let the silence do the work that questions couldn't. And he would wait for the woman behind the counter to decide on her own terms and in her own time whether or not she was ready to stop hiding. Across the diner, the morning continued. Coffee was poured. Plates were cleared. The television murmured something about the weather forecast for Central Virginia. A truck rumbled past on Route 9, rattling the windows slightly before fading into the distance. But the air near the counter remained different. Charged. Like the atmosphere before a summer storm when the sky hasn't darkened yet, but the pressure has already changed, and every living thing within a mile can feel that something is about to break open. Ren felt it. Coulter felt it. Coda felt it. And in the corner booth, Merle Ashford set his empty coffee mug down on the table, folded his newspaper into a neat rectangle, and waited. He didn't know the details yet. He didn't know the names or the dates or the places, but he knew the feeling. He had carried it himself for 3 decades, ever since a night in Kuwait, when the sky turned orange, and the man beside him stopped breathing, and the world he had known before that moment became a place he could never fully return to. Merle recognized what was happening at that counter because he had lived his own version of it. And he knew with the quiet certainty of a man who had learned this lesson the hardest way possible that the truth doesn't always arrive on your schedule. Sometimes it walks through a diner door on a metal crutch, with a dog at its side, and it sits down beside you before you even realize what it is. And once it sits down, it doesn't leave until you look at it. The morning sun climbed higher above the Virginia tree line. Light poured through the diner's east-facing windows and fell in long, warm stripes across the tile floor, illuminating the dust motes drifting lazily in the still air. It touched the chrome edge of the counter, the dog's dark fur, the folded sleeve of a woman who had once saved lives in the worst place on earth and now spent her mornings pouring coffee for strangers who would never know her name. Outside, a bird landed on the power line above the parking lot and sang 3 notes before flying away. Inside, the Pinewood Diner hummed with the ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning. But nothing about this morning was ordinary anymore. And everyone in that room, whether they understood why or not, could feel it. Coulter ate slowly, not because the food required it. Scrambled eggs and wheat toast are not the kind of meal that demands careful attention. But Coulter Reed had learned a long time ago in places where patience was the difference between coming home and not coming home, that the best way to understand a situation was to sit inside it and let it speak to you. So he ate, he chewed, he sipped his coffee, and he watched. Wren moved behind the counter with the fluid efficiency of a woman who had memorized every square inch of her workspace. She refilled mugs without being asked, cleared plates before customers had to look around for her, and kept the counter wiped to a shine that had nothing to do with cleanliness and everything to do with keeping her hands busy. She was good at her job, remarkably good. The kind of good that comes from treating work not as a task, but as a place to hide. Coulter recognized the strategy because he had used it himself. In the 18 months after losing his leg before he had learned to sleep through the night again, he had filled every waking hour with activity. Physical therapy, dog training with Coda, long drives on back roads where the engine noise was loud enough to drown out the sounds his memory kept replaying. Busy hands, busy mind. No room for the thing crouching in the dark corner of his thoughts waiting for a quiet moment to pounce. Wren was doing the same thing. He was sure of it now. The constant movement, the careful attention to trivial tasks, the way she never stood still long enough for silence to catch up with her. She was running. Not from anyone. From something inside herself that she hadn't figured out how to face. Coda hadn't moved. The German Shepherd remained seated near the base of Wren's section of the counter, positioned so the dog could track her movement in either direction without having to stand. The animal's ears rotated like small radar dishes, following sounds that human ears couldn't distinguish from the background noise of the diner. Every few seconds, Coda's nose twitched, sampling the air with the kind of focused intensity that civilian dogs reserve for food, and military dogs reserve for things that matter far more than food. Coulter had seen Coda work in the field. He had watched the dog clear buildings in Helmand Province, moving through doorways and down corridors with a precision that made the human operators behind it look clumsy by comparison. He had seen Coda locate a buried IED from 40 meters away, in a crosswind, sitting down calmly beside the spot the way the dog was sitting now, perfectly still, perfectly certain, refusing to move until the humans around it understood what it already knew. That was the behavior Coulter was looking at right now. Not curiosity, not affection, recognition. Coda had identified something about this woman that triggered a response buried deep in the dog's training, something associated with the world that both of them had left behind, but neither of them had forgotten. Coulter set his fork down and picked up his coffee mug, wrapping both hands around it, the way people do when they need something to hold on to while they think. "Busy morning?" he said. Wren glanced at him, a quick, practiced look, the kind that acknowledges a customer's comment without inviting a longer conversation. "Most mornings are," she replied. She was restocking the straw dispenser near the register, her hands moving with mechanical precision. "Truckers, construction guys, regulars. Same faces every week." "How long you been working here?" "About 2 years." "You from around here?" "Close enough." The answers were short. Clean. Delivered with the pleasant neutrality of someone who had rehearsed the art of saying nothing while appearing to say something. Coulter had conducted enough tactical debriefs to recognize when a person was managing information. Not lying exactly, just controlling what got through. He took another sip of coffee and let a few seconds pass. Then he tried a different angle. "You ever work anywhere else?" Wren's hands paused. The interruption was brief, barely a quarter of a second, the kind of hesitation that most people would never notice in the normal flow of conversation. But Coulter noticed it the way a seismologist notices a tremor that nobody else felt. Something beneath the surface had shifted. "Not really," she said. "Just here." The response came too fast. Not the speed of someone telling the truth, which has a natural uneven rhythm. The speed of someone who has prepared an answer in advance and deployed it before the question had time to settle. Coda shifted on the floor. The dog's tail brushed lightly against the tile, a single slow sweep, and its dark eyes remained fixed on Ren with the unwavering patience of an animal that understood time differently than humans do. Dogs don't get impatient with silence, they live inside it. And Coda seemed perfectly content to sit in front of this woman for as long as it took for whatever was going to happen. Coulter leaned back slightly on his stool. He exhaled through his nose, a slow, controlled breath, the kind that comes before a decision. He could drop it. He could finish his eggs, pay his bill, tip well, and walk out the door without pressing the woman behind the counter to explain why his dead friend's dog was treating her like someone it had known in another life. But Coulter Reed had spent too many years in a world where ignoring what was right in front of you could get people killed. And something about this moment, the dog's behavior, the woman's careful evasion, the scar he had glimpsed on her wrist, felt important in a way he couldn't dismiss. He watched Ren carry a stack of plates to a booth near the window, her left arm extended to balance the weight. As she leaned forward to set them down, the sleeve of her left arm shifted again. This time the scar was visible for a full 3 seconds. Thin. Precise. Running along the inside of her wrist in a line that was too straight and too deliberate to be accidental. Coulter knew that mark. He had seen it on the forearms of combat medics who had applied field tourniquets under conditions where the difference between a clean application and a messy one was the difference between keeping a limb and losing one. He had seen it on his own body in the months after Kandahar, when the surgeons at Walter Reed had pointed to the marks left by the emergency tourniquet that had been cinched around his thigh in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter, while the rotors screamed and the medic working on him shouted instructions to someone he couldn't see. That scar on Ren's wrist did not come from a kitchen. It did not come from a car accident. It did not come from any place where the people around you have the luxury of being careful. Ren returned to the counter. Coulter waited until she was close enough that the conversation would stay between them, then spoke quietly. "You ever work around military bases?" Ren shook her head without looking up from the mug she was rinsing in the small sink behind the counter. "No," she said. But her voice had changed. The pleasant neutrality was still there, but something underneath it had tightened. A string pulled taut. A door being held shut from the inside. Coulter didn't push. Not yet. He glanced around the diner, briefly reading the room the way he had been trained to read rooms. The customers who had refused him a seat earlier were scattered across the booths and tables, some eating, some talking, all of them stealing looks at the counter where the K9 was still sitting at attention in front of the waitress. A few of them wore the uneasy expressions of people who knew they were watching something they didn't fully understand, but couldn't bring themselves to look away from. The man in the trucker cap near the register was staring openly now. His coffee forgotten, his eyes moving between the dog and the woman like he was watching the final minutes of a game he hadn't expected to care about. Even Hank had slowed down behind the kitchen window. His spatula rested against the edge of the grill, and his eyes were fixed on the exchange at the counter with the quiet concern of a man who cared about his employee, but knew better than to interfere with whatever was unfolding. Coulter turned back to Ren and lowered his voice. Not to a whisper, but to the register that conversations drop into when both people know the words are meant only for each other. "Coda doesn't usually do this," he said. "He's trained to stay focused on me unless he recognizes something." Ren forced a small smile. It was convincing enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking for the cracks in it. "Maybe he just likes the smell of bacon," she said. Coulter didn't smile back. Not because the comment wasn't clever. It was. But because the dog sitting 3 feet from Ren's legs had spent 4 years in Afghanistan working alongside combat handlers and military medical personnel. And it did not respond to breakfast smells the way it was responding to this woman. He picked up his fork again and took another bite of eggs. He chewed slowly, letting the silence rebuild between them. Then he spoke again, and this time his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Coda spent a lot of time with combat medics overseas," he said. "Dogs like him don't just remember scents. They remember people. The way someone moves, the way they breathe under stress, the way their hands feel. Military canines build profiles of the humans they work with, and those profiles don't fade the way human memories do. A dog like Coda can walk into a room 10 years later and recognize someone he worked with, even if everything else about them has changed." He paused, turning the coffee mug slowly between his hands. "Even years later, even when the person has been out of the service long enough to build a completely different life, the dog remembers. Not just the smell, the whole person. Dogs carry memories in their bodies the way we carry them in our heads. The difference is dogs don't know how to lie about what they remember. Well, the words sat in the air between them. Coulter hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't leaned forward or narrowed his eyes or done anything that could be mistaken for confrontation. He had simply stated a fact the way a man states a fact when he wants the truth to do the work that pressure cannot. Wren's hand tightened around the handle of the coffee pot she was holding. The grip shifted just enough for the handle to creak softly against her palm. A small sound, barely audible over the hum of the diner. But in the space between Coulter's words and the silence that followed them, it landed like a gunshot. She could feel the walls trembling. Not the walls of the diner. The walls inside her. The ones she had built brick by careful brick over 9 years, mortared with routine and silence, and the disciplined refusal to let anyone close enough to ask the questions that this stranger was now asking over a plate of scrambled eggs. Those walls had held through lonely nights in her apartment when the memories pressed against her skull like something trying to break out. They had held through the anniversaries of that night, the dates she marked on no calendar, but her body always remembered the mornings she woke already shaking before the first light crossed her window. They had held through every loud noise, every helicopter overhead, every 4th of July firework that sounded less like celebration and more like incoming fire. But they were not holding now. Something about the dog. Something about the steady way this man spoke. Something about the fact that he had described military K-9 behavior with the casual precision of someone who had lived inside that world, not just read about it. The walls were cracking, and Wren could feel the pressure of everything behind them pushing forward, demanding release. She set the pot down quickly. Too quickly. The base hit the warmer plate with a sharp click that made the customer 2 stools down glance over. Wren straightened the stack of menus beside the register, aligning their edges with a precision that had nothing to do with organization and everything to do with needing something for her hands to do. "I think you're reading too much into it," she said calmly. But the calm was manufactured now. Coulter could see the effort behind it, the way a person can see the current beneath still water if they know where to look. Whatever Wren was carrying, whatever story was hidden beneath the sleeves and the short answers and the practiced routine of a woman who had made herself invisible, it was rising toward the surface faster than she could push it back down. Coulter reached down and scratched behind Coda's ear. The dog leaned into the touch briefly, but didn't take its eyes off Wren. Not for a second. Not for a fraction of a second. The animal's focus was absolute, locked onto the woman behind the counter, with the same unbreakable attention it had once given to bomb-sniffing exercises in the sand-colored hills outside Kandahar. A few minutes passed. The diner continued its slow rotation of morning noise. Plates clinked. Someone laughed near the window. The television droned through a commercial for a car dealership in Fredericksburg. Wren served 2 more customers, took an order from a booth near the door, and carried a bus tray of dirty dishes to the kitchen without once looking directly at Coulter or the dog. But Coda tracked her every step. And Coulter watched Coda the way a man watches a compass when he suspects the terrain around him has changed. When Wren returned to the counter, Coulter spoke again. His voice was quiet, steady, almost gentle. The voice of a man who had once led other men into situations where trust was built in seconds, or not at all, and who had learned that the gentlest questions often carried the most weight. "You sure you never served?" The question landed in the small space between them like a stone dropped into a well. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of the grill behind the kitchen window and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the dog at Wren's feet. Wren didn't answer right away. She stood very still behind the counter, her hands resting on the formica surface, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere between the coffee pot and the edge of the register. From the outside, she looked calm, composed, a woman pausing in the middle of a busy shift to consider a question that didn't require much thought. But inside, something was collapsing. The walls she had built over 9 years, the careful architecture of silence and routine and deflection that had allowed her to exist in this diner, in this town, in this version of herself, were developing cracks that she could feel spreading through her chest, like fractures in ice. Every question Coulter asked, every second that Coda spent sitting at her feet with those dark, knowing eyes, every mention of military bases and combat medics and scent profiles was a hammer, striking the foundation of the life she had constructed on top of everything she was trying to forget. She could lie again. She could shake her head and give another deflection, and let the moment pass and hope that the man on the stool would finish his breakfast and leave and take his dog and his questions with him. She had done it before. She was good at it. 9 years of practice had made her an expert at closing doors in people's faces without them even realizing a door had been there. But Coda was still sitting in front of her, and the dog's eyes held something that no human in this diner had ever offered her. Not suspicion, not curiosity, not the polite disinterest of customers who saw a waitress and nothing more. What the dog's eyes held was recognition. Pure, uncomplicated, absolute recognition. The kind that doesn't need words or explanations or proof. The kind that simply knows. And for the first time in 9 years, being known felt more terrifying than being invisible. Coda gently placed his head against her knee. The contact was soft, almost tentative. The way a dog approaches someone it trusts, but hasn't seen in a very long time. The warmth of the animal's fur pressed through the fabric of her jeans, and Ren felt something crack open inside her chest that she had spent years sealing shut. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. When she opened them, she didn't look at Coulter. She looked at the dog. And for a moment, the diner and the customers and the television and the smell of bacon and the sound of plates and every other piece of the ordinary world she had wrapped around herself like armor simply fell away. She was in the dirt again. Kandahar. 9 years ago. The night sky split open by explosions that turned the darkness into stuttering daylight. The radio screaming with voices that overlapped and contradicted each other. The smell of burning metal and cordite and blood and sand that had been kicked into the air by helicopter rotors. She remembered the medical tent. Canvas walls shaking with each concussion. Fluorescent light from a portable generator casting everything in a cold blue-white glow. Wounded men arriving faster than she could assess them. A corpseman beside her shouting vitals while she worked on a chest wound that should have killed the man beneath her hands 20 minutes ago, but somehow hadn't. Blood on the floor of the tent, so much of it that her boots lost traction when she moved between patients. The smell of copper and iodine and burned fabric mixing into something that didn't have a name, but would never leave her memory. She was 22 years old. She had been in Afghanistan for 7 months. She had treated gunshot wounds, blast injuries, shrapnel lacerations and burns, severe enough to make experienced surgeons look away. She had done all of it with steady hands and a voice that never wavered, because the men on the ground needed to believe that the person working on them knew what she was doing, and belief was sometimes the only anesthesia available. But that night was different. That night, the wounded arrived in waves that overwhelmed every protocol she had been trained to follow. Triage became guesswork. Treatment became a series of impossible decisions made in seconds. Save this man or that man. Stop this bleeding or that bleeding. Use the last pressure bandage here or there. Every choice meant someone lived and someone else might not. And the weight of those choices accumulated in her chest like stones being placed one by one on top of her lungs. She remembered the radio command. Clear and direct. The voice of an officer who was not inside the tent, who could not see what she was seeing, who did not have his hands inside a man's chest cavity, trying to stop the bleeding that wouldn't stop. Angel 6 extractions in 90 seconds. Fall back to the landing zone. That is a direct order. She remembered looking at the men still lying on the ground around her. 3 of them. 1 critical, 2 serious. None of them could walk. The landing zone was 200 meters west. 90 seconds was not enough time to move all 3. It was barely enough time to move 1. She remembered the choice. Not a dramatic, cinematic choice made in slow motion with swelling music. A fast, ugly, terrible choice made in the space of a single heartbeat, while the ground shook and the radio repeated the order and every cell in her body screamed at her to run. She stayed. She keyed the radio and said 3 words that ended her military career. Negative. Not leaving. Then she went back to work. The next 11 minutes were the longest of her life. She stabilized the critical patient-applied tourniquets to the 2 serious cases and began dragging the first man toward the landing zone on a makeshift litter made from a stretcher and 2 cargo straps. Midway through the second trip, a handler came through the tent flap. Young, bleeding from a wound in his shoulder that he didn't seem to notice. A German shepherd stumbled in behind him, covered in dust, its eyes wide and searching. The handler was carrying a wounded operator over his good shoulder. He set the man down on the ground beside the litter and looked at Ren with eyes that were already starting to lose focus. 2 more outside, he said. His voice was calm in the way that voices become calm when the body is shutting down faster than the mind can process it. South wall, can't move them. Ren looked at his shoulder. The wound was worse than he was letting on. She could see the dark pulse of arterial bleeding beneath the torn fabric of his uniform. She pulled a tourniquet from her kit and reached for his arm. Sit down, she said. Let me. No time. He shook his head. The dog pressed against his leg. Get these men on the bird. I'll bring the others. He turned and walked back out into the night. The dog followed. Ren watched them disappear into the smoke and the noise and something inside her. Some instinct that lived deeper than training and deeper than fear told her she was watching a man walk toward the last thing he would ever do. She was right. The second explosion hit 4 minutes later. She heard it from inside the tent, a sound so massive it seemed to come from everywhere at once, swallowing the air and replacing it with the pressure that made her eardrums flex. The canvas walls of the medical tent bowed inward and then snapped back like the lungs of a living thing taking a breath. When the dust cleared and the ringing in her ears subsided enough to hear the radio again, the landing zone was operational. 2 wounded operators were already being loaded onto the Black Hawk. 2 more were being carried toward the helicopter by soldiers she didn't recognize. The handler was not among them. Ren found him 40 meters south of the tent lying on his back in the sand beside a collapsed section of wall. The dog was beside him. The German Shepherd had its head resting on the man's chest, its body pressed against his side, its dark eyes staring at nothing. The handler was still alive. Barely. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and the wound in his shoulder had been joined by something far worse beneath his vest. Ren dropped to her knees and went to work. She cut away his gear, applied pressure, shouted for a stretcher that she knew wasn't coming fast enough. His eyes found hers. The fear was gone from them. Whatever had been keeping him moving for the last 20 minutes had burned itself out, and what was left was the quiet, exhausted clarity of a man who had already accepted what was happening to him. He didn't speak, but his hand moved slowly, painfully, until it rested on the dog's head. His fingers curled into the fur behind the animal's ear. And then his eyes closed. Ren kept working. She kept working long after there was nothing left to work toward. She kept her hands pressed against wounds that had stopped bleeding because the heart behind them had stopped pumping. She kept going because stopping meant admitting that the man on the ground in front of her was gone, and she was not ready to admit that. Not there. Not in the sand. Not with the dog still pressed against his side waiting for him to get up. The medevac team pulled her away. She didn't remember letting go. She didn't remember standing. She didn't remember the helicopter lifting off, or the sound of the rotors fading into the gray dawn sky. What she remembered was the dog. The German Shepherd standing in the empty space where the handler had been looking at the ground like it was waiting for something that would never come back. That image had followed her for 9 years. Ren opened her eyes. The diner reassembled itself around her. The counter, the coffee pot, the television, the customers, the smell of bacon instead of blood, the sound of forks instead of gunfire. She looked down at Coda. The dog was still beside her, its body warm against her shin, its dark eyes steady and unblinking. And in those eyes, Ren saw something she had been running from since the night she knelt in the sand and held a dying man's hand while the world burned around them. She saw the dog that had been there, not the same dog. She knew that. The rational part of her mind understood that 9 years had passed and military K-9s had service lives, and this could not be the same animal she had seen lying beside a dead handler in the Afghan dust. But the eyes were the same. The steadiness, the patience, the quiet, unshakable loyalty of an animal that had loved someone who wasn't coming back and had never fully stopped looking for them. Ren exhaled slowly. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the counter to still them and looked up at Coulter. He was watching her. Not with suspicion, not with accusation, with the calm, patient attention of a man who had already figured out the answer and was simply waiting for her to say it. "I wasn't a soldier," she said quietly. The words came out rough, as if they had been stored somewhere dry and airless for a very long time. "I wasn't even supposed to be near the front lines." Coulter didn't move, didn't nod, didn't speak. He just listened. "I was a combat medic," she continued. Her voice steadied slightly, the way a person's voice steadies when they stop fighting the current and let it carry them. "Attached to a SEAL unit for emergency response. We went where things went wrong." The diner had gone quiet again. Not the polite quiet of customers lowering their voices. The deep-held breath quiet of people who can feel that something important is being said, even if they can only hear fragments of it. The truckers near the register had stopped pretending to watch the television. The man in the trucker cap was staring at Ren with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and something that looked very much like shame. Even the young couple in the back booth had put their phones down. Coulter's voice was gentle when he spoke. "Call sign." Ren hesitated. The name sat on the edge of her tongue like a word in a language she hadn't spoken in years. A name that belonged to a version of herself that she had tried to bury in a small town in Virginia under an apron and a pot of coffee and 2 years of silence. "Angel 6 is," she said. The 2 words changed the air pressure inside the diner. Coulter's expression shifted. Not dramatically. A civilian wouldn't have noticed it. But Ren noticed it because she had spent years reading faces in conditions where micro-expressions were the only warning you got before everything fell apart. Something behind his eyes moved, a door opening in a room he thought he had locked. Angel 6, he repeated quietly, almost to himself. The name sat between them on the counter like an object neither of them had expected to find. He knew the name. Not personally, not the way you know someone you've met, but the way you know a story that gets passed between soldiers in the quiet hours after an operation when the adrenaline has worn off and the dead have been counted and the living are trying to make sense of what they survived. Angel 6 was one of those stories. A medic who refused extraction. A medic who stayed behind while the helicopters were taking fire. A medic who kept working on wounded operators long after the order to fall back had been given twice. The men who had been on the ground that night spoke about Angel 6 the way men speak about things they saw in combat that defied explanation. Not with bravado, not with the embellished swagger of war stories told over beers. With quiet reverence. With the kind of awe that comes from watching someone do something that everyone in the room knows they themselves would not have had the courage to do. Coulter had heard the story for the first time 3 weeks after Kandahar, in a hospital room at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, while waiting for the doctors to decide whether the infection in what remained of his right leg was going to require a second surgery. A sergeant from the support element had mentioned it in passing, the way soldiers mention legends they aren't sure are real. A female combat medic who had defied a direct order to evacuate because there were still wounded men on the ground. A medic who had kept working under fire for 11 minutes after the extraction window closed. A medic whose call sign was Angel 6. Nobody knew her real name. Nobody knew what had happened to her after that night. The story had circulated through SEAL units and support elements for months after Kandahar, but nobody knew what had happened to the medic afterward. The name had simply disappeared from the operational record. Now Coulter understood why. "They discharged you," he said. It wasn't a question. Ren's jaw tightened. She nodded once, a small controlled movement that carried the weight of something she had never said out loud to another human being. "I disobeyed a direct order," she said. "Refused extraction. Stayed with the wounded." She paused. "The men I stayed for, most of them made it onto the helicopter. But the order was the order, and I broke it." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes had changed. The careful blankness she had maintained all morning was gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded. The look of a person standing in an open field with no cover and no weapon and no plan except to keep breathing. "They pulled my file," she continued. "Erased my service record. No commendation, no discharge papers anyone would recognize. I walked out of the military like I was never there." She pulled her left sleeve up, slightly exposing the scar on her wrist fully for the first time. The thin white line caught the fluorescent light above the counter and held it. "This is the only proof I was ever in," she said. "This and the dreams." She said the word dreams the way other people say the word terminal, like something she had learned to live around but never learned to live with. 9 years of waking up in the dark with her hands reaching for a wound that wasn't there. 9 years of hearing the radio in her sleep. 9 years of carrying the weight of a man she couldn't save, and a career that had been taken from her for trying. Nobody in the diner moved. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath. Even the grill in the kitchen had gone quiet. Hank, standing motionless behind the service window, with a spatula in one hand and an expression on his face that looked like a man realizing he had been standing next to a story for 2 years without ever knowing it was there. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. Heavier than the plates stacked behind the counter. Heavier than the cast iron grill in the kitchen. Heavier than the memory of a night in Kandahar that 2 strangers in a Virginia diner were now carrying between them, like a stretcher bearing a weight that neither could hold alone. Coulter set his coffee mug down. He placed both hands flat on the counter, mirroring Ren's posture without realizing it, and looked at her with the steady, unblinking directness of a man about to say something that would change the shape of the conversation permanently. "I was there that night," he said. Ren stared at him. "Different team," he continued. "We were providing overwatch when your unit got hit. My squad moved to the South Ridge to cover the extraction corridor." He paused. "I heard your call sign on the radio twice. Once when they ordered you to fall back and once when you told them no." The air between them became very still. Ren's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. She searched his face the way a person searches a photograph for a detail they missed the first time, looking for something that would confirm or deny what she was hearing. Coulter's eyes drifted down to Coda, who was still pressed against Ren's leg with the quiet persistence of an animal that had no intention of moving. "The handler you tried to save," he said. "His name was Briggs, Staff Sergeant Owen Briggs." Ren flinched. It was small. A tightening of the muscles around her eyes, a barely perceptible contraction of her shoulders. But it was the first involuntary reaction she had shown all morning, and it told Coulter everything he needed to know. "He was my friend," Coulter said quietly. "We came up through BUD/S in the same class. Served together for 6 years before he transferred to the K-9 unit." He reached down and rested his hand on Coda's harness. The dog looked up at him briefly, then returned its gaze to Wren. "This is his dog," Coulter said. Briggs was Coda's original handler. After that night after Briggs was killed, Coda was retired from service. I took him, couldn't let him go to anyone else. Wren looked down at the dog. The crack in her chest that had been widening since the moment Coda first sat in front of her now split wide open, and 9 years of carefully maintained silence collapsed into the space it left behind. She remembered the handler's face. She remembered his calm voice saying, "2 more outside south wall, can't move them." She remembered the blood on his shoulder and the way he shook his head when she tried to treat him. She remembered the dog pressing against his leg as he walked back out into the darkness. And she remembered his hand resting on the dog's head, fingers curling into the fur in the last moment before his eyes closed for the final time. Coda. This was that dog. The same dog that had lain beside Briggs in the sand. The same dog that had stood in the empty space after the medevac team carried him away. The same dog that was now pressing its head against Wren's knee in a roadside diner in Virginia 9 years later, as if no time had passed at all. Wren pressed her hand against her mouth, not to stifle a sound, to hold herself together. The diner blurred around the edges. The customers, the counter, the television, the morning light coming through the windows, all of it softened into an impressionist painting of a world that suddenly felt very far away. Around them, the diner had surrendered any pretense of normalcy. Nobody was eating, nobody was scrolling their phone, nobody was talking. Every person in the Pinewood diner was watching the scene at the counter with the kind of silence that only arrives when people recognize they are witnessing something they were never supposed to see. The men who had refused Coulter a seat sat in their booths with their heads slightly lowered, their earlier excuses hanging in the air around them like smoke that wouldn't clear. The father who had said he needed the whole table was staring at his plate. The young man who had slid to the center of his booth was looking at the counter with an expression that suggested he was replaying the moment in his head and not liking what he saw. And in the corner booth, Merle Ashford sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his pale blue eyes fixed on Wren's face with an expression that held no surprise at all, only confirmation, only the quiet, heavy nod of a man who had been waiting a long time for a truth he already knew to finally be spoken out loud. The diner had become a different room than it had been an hour ago. Not physically. The same booths, the same tile floor, the same television murmuring from the wall mount above the register. But the people inside it had changed. Or rather, their understanding of the people inside it had changed. The construction worker who had pulled his chair in when Coulter approached now sat with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw working slowly on nothing, the way a man chews air when he is trying to swallow something that has nothing to do with food. 2 booths away, the mother who had placed her hand protectively on her child's shoulder when Coulter came near was now holding that same child's hand under the table, squeezing it gently the way people hold onto small things when the big things become too much to carry. Even the cook had come out from behind the kitchen wall. Hank stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the counter, his apron spotted with grease, his arms hanging at his sides. He looked at Wren the way a man looks at a photograph he's seen 1,000 times and suddenly realizes he's been looking at wrong. For 2 years she had worked in his diner. For 2 years she had poured coffee and carried plates and said, "Good morning," and "You're welcome," and "Have a good day," with the practiced warmth of a woman who wanted nothing more than to be unremarkable. And for 2 years, Hank had let her be exactly that, because he believed that people deserved the privacy of their own pain. But standing in the kitchen doorway now, watching the tears she was trying not to let fall, and the dog stationed at her side like a sentry, and the disabled veteran sitting across from her with the expression of a man who had just found something he didn't know he was looking for. Hank Prescott realized that sometimes privacy isn't protection. Sometimes it's a prison. And sometimes the only way out is for someone to walk through the door and recognize the person inside. The morning light shifted as a cloud moved across the sun outside the diner windows. The room dimmed slightly, then brightened again. And in that small change of light, the Pinewood diner felt like a different place than it had been an hour ago. Because the woman behind the counter was no longer just a waitress, and the man sitting across from her was no longer just a stranger looking for a place to sit, And the dog between them was no longer just a well-trained animal following the commands of its handler. They were three survivors of the same night. Three pieces of a story that had been broken apart 9 years ago and scattered across different lives and different silences, and was now, for reasons that none of them had planned, and none of them could fully explain, coming back together inside a small roadside diner on a Tuesday morning in Virginia. Wren looked at Coulter. Coulter looked at Wren. And between them, Coda leaned against the leg of a woman who had once held his dying handler in her arms and told him that everything was going to be all right, knowing it wasn't saying it anyway, because sometimes the last thing a person hears should be a lie that sounds like love. The dog remembered. After 9 years across thousands of miles through a different name and a different life, and a diner that smelled like bacon and coffee instead of blood and sand, the dog remembered. And now, whether she was ready for it or not, Wren was going to have to remember too. Not just the parts she had carried in her nightmares, not just the guilt and the loss and the sound of the radio ordering her to leave, but the rest of it, the part of the story she had never heard, the part that had been waiting 9 years to find her. And it had found her the only way it could, not through military records or government databases, or the careful detective work of men searching for a name that had been erased. It had found her through the nose of a German shepherd who had never stopped looking for the hands that had tried to save the person he loved most in the world. The morning was only half over, and the hardest part was still to come. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The diner held its breath around them, the way a church holds silence during a prayer that no one wants to interrupt. The television above the register had moved on to the weather forecast. A woman in a bright blue blazer pointing at a map of Virginia and talking about a warm front moving in from the west. But her voice was just noise now. Meaningless sound filling a room that had become a place where noise no longer mattered. Wren stood behind the counter with both hands pressed flat against the formica surface. Her fingers were spread slightly, the way a person braces themselves against a table when the floor beneath them has started to shift. The tears she had been fighting since the moment Coulter said Briggs's name were winning now, not falling yet, but gathering in the corners of her eyes with the slow inevitability of water finding its level. Coda hadn't moved from her side. The dog remained close, its aging body pressed against her leg, warm and solid, a point of contact that felt like an anchor in a room that had suddenly lost its gravity. The animal's breathing was slow and even, the way a trained K9 breathes when it is performing a task. It was built for not detection, not patrol, not the sharp-edged work of finding threats in hostile territory. This was something older than training, something that lived in the space between instinct and devotion. The dog was doing the only thing it knew how to do for someone it recognized as part of its pack. It was staying close. Coulter gave the silence room. He understood in the way that only people who have lived through the same kind of silence can understand that what was happening behind Wren's eyes right now was not something that could be rushed. The memory of Kandahar was not a single image. It was an avalanche. Once it started moving, it carried everything with it. The sounds, the smells, the faces, the choices, the guilt, and the only thing you could do was let it run its course and hope that when it stopped, you were still standing. He had been through his own version of that avalanche, in hospital rooms, in physical therapy sessions where the pain in his missing leg was somehow worse than the pain that had been in his real one. In the back seats of taxis driving through American cities that felt foreign and loud and impossibly soft compared to the places he had spent the best years of his life. He had let the avalanche bury him more than once. And each time the thing that had pulled him back to the surface was not courage or discipline or any of the words people use when they talk about soldiers being strong. It was Coda, pressing against his side, breathing slowly, staying close. The same thing the dog was doing for Wren right now. Coulter waited until the silence had settled into something that felt less like a wound and more like a clearing, a space where words might be able to land without breaking anything. Then he spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of weight that quiet voices carry when the person speaking has chosen every word carefully. "About Briggs, about what happened after you treated him." Wren looked up. Her eyes were red at the edges, but her jaw was set, and the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who had decided that if the past was going to find her, she would face it standing up. "I watched him die," she said. The words came out flat, stripped of everything except the fact they contained. "I held pressure on his wounds until there was nothing left to hold. I know what happened." Coulter shook his head slowly. Not a contradiction, more like a correction, The gentle kind, the kind a person offers when they know the other person has been carrying a version of events that is missing a piece so important it changes the entire picture. You know what happened in front of you, he said, but you don't know what happened after you stabilized him. Ren frowned. The muscles around her eyes tightened, and for a moment the grief in her expression was replaced by something sharper. Confusion. The look of a person being told that a story they have memorized word for word has a chapter they have never read. After I stabilized him, she repeated. He was barely conscious. He could barely breathe. I know, Coulter said, but he was conscious enough. He paused, turning his coffee mug slowly on the counter. The mug left a small ring of moisture on the formica, and Coulter stared at it for a moment before continuing, as if the words he was about to say needed one more second to arrange themselves properly. After you applied the tourniquet to his shoulder and packed the abdominal wound, Briggs regained enough awareness to move. Not much, not far, but enough. Not far. But Ren shook her head. The motion was small but definite. That's not possible. The injuries were too severe. When I left him to move the other patients toward the landing zone, he was dying, Coulter said. Yes, but he wasn't dead yet. And the 10 minutes you gave him by stopping the bleeding were 10 minutes he used. The air between them changed again. Ren felt it the way she used to feel changes in atmospheric pressure before a storm rolled across the Afghan highlands, a physical sensation, a tightening of the skin, a shift in the quality of the light. Used for what? She asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. Coulter met her eyes. In his gaze there was no pity, no condescension, only the steady, unflinching honesty of a man who had carried this piece of the story for 9 years and was finally delivering it to the only person who needed to hear it. There were 2 wounded operators lying behind the south wall of the compound, he said. Sergeant First Class Mike Dunleavy and Petty Officer Second Class Aaron Webb. Both were hit by shrapnel from the first explosion. Neither could move under their own power. When the extraction order came through, they were outside the evacuation perimeter. No one on the medevac team knew they were there. Ren's lips parted slightly. She didn't speak. Briggs knew, Coulter continued. He had seen them when he came through the compound earlier before he reached your medical tent. He told you there were 2 more outside. South wall. Remember. Ren remembered. The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were new, but because she had heard them before. In the tent. From a man with blood on his shoulder and calm in his voice, and a dog pressed against his leg. 2 more outside. South wall. Can't move them. After you moved toward the landing zone with the other patients, Coulter said. Briggs got up. Ren stared at him. The impossibility of what he was describing warred with the certainty in his voice. He shouldn't have been able to stand, she said. He shouldn't have been able to do a lot of things, Coulter replied. But he did them anyway. He dragged himself out of that tent and made it to the south wall. Coda was with him. The dog guided him through the debris. Coulter paused. His hand moved to Coda's harness, and the dog looked up at him with dark, knowing eyes. Briggs reached Dunleavy and Webb. He couldn't carry them. He didn't have the strength for that, but he got them onto their feet, got them moving. Webb had a broken leg, so Briggs put the man's arm over his good shoulder and walked him 30 meters toward the extraction point. Then he went back for Dunleavy. The kitchen was silent. The grill had been turned off, or perhaps Hank had simply stopped using it. The only sound from behind the service window was the faint drip of a faucet that needed a new washer. The second explosion hit while Briggs was moving Dunleavy across the open ground between the south wall and the landing zone, Coulter said. The blast threw both of them. Dunleavy landed 15 meters from the helicopter, close enough for the crew to reach him. They pulled him aboard. Coulter's voice had grown quieter with each sentence, as if the words themselves were getting heavier. Briggs was 40 meters out. The blast had reopened everything you had closed. The tourniquet held, but the abdominal wound, he stopped, swallowed. When he continued, his voice was steady, but the effort behind that steadiness was visible. He didn't make it to the helicopter, but the 2 men he moved did. The words settled over the counter like dust settling after an explosion. Ren stood motionless, her hands still pressed against the formica, her eyes locked on Coulter's face. Dunleavy and Webb both survived, Coulter said. Dunleavy retired last year, lives in North Carolina with his wife and 3 kids. Webb is still active duty stationed at Little Creek. They're alive because Briggs moved them. And Briggs was able to move them because of the 10 minutes you gave him when you stopped the bleeding in that tent. Ren's hands began to tremble. She pressed them harder against the counter, but the trembling didn't stop. It moved up her arms and into her shoulders and settled somewhere deep in her chest, where it became something that was no longer physical. I didn't know, she said. The words came out broken. Not the clean, controlled sentences she had used all morning. Fragments. The voice of a woman whose understanding of the worst night of her life had just been rewritten. No one told you? Coulter said gently. Because by the time the after-action report was filed, your record had already been pulled. There was no one to tell. The cruelty of it hung in the air. Not a deliberate cruelty, not the kind that comes from malice or intent. The bureaucratic kind. The kind that happens when systems operate on rules instead of recognition, when a woman saves lives by breaking an order and the system responds by erasing her. And in the erasing takes away not just her career, but her ability to know that what she did mattered. For 9 years, Wren had believed she failed. She had believed that Briggs died on the ground where she left him, that the 10 minutes she fought for were 10 minutes of suffering she had prolonged rather than prevented. She had built her entire life after the military on the foundation of that belief. The small apartment, the diner job, the silence, the sleeves pulled down over a scar she couldn't bear to explain. All of it had been constructed on the conviction that she had stayed behind, and it hadn't been enough. And now, standing behind the counter of the Pinewood Diner, while a silver-muzzled German shepherd refused to leave her side, and a one-legged Navy SEAL sat across from her with the truth she had never been given, the foundation cracked. Not the slow, creeping kind of crack that develops over time. The sudden, total kind. The kind that happens when you remove the single load-bearing belief that an entire structure has been built on, and everything above it simply falls. Wren's breath caught, then released, then caught again. Her vision blurred, and the tears that had been gathering since Coulter said Briggs's name finally fell. Not dramatically, not with the visible performative grief that people display when they want others to know they are sad. Quietly. Privately. 2 thin lines of moisture tracing down her cheeks, while her hands gripped the counter like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had just shifted beneath her feet. Coda pressed harder against her leg. The dog made a soft sound, not a whine. Something gentler. Something that sat closer to the frequency of a purr, and the warmth of the animal's body against her shin was the only thing keeping her from folding in half. From the corner booth, a chair scraped against the tile floor. The sound cut through the heavy air of the diner like a blade, and every head turned toward it. Merle Ashford was standing. The old man rose slowly from his seat the way men rise when their knees carry 30 years of protest, and their pride refuses to acknowledge it. He pushed his chair back, lifted his faded Desert Storm cap from his head, and held it at his side. Then he walked toward the counter. His steps were measured and deliberate, the unhurried stride of a man who had decided to do something and would not be deterred by the eyes now following him across the room. The cap hung from his right hand. His left hand hung loose at his side, the fingers slightly curled as if they were holding something invisible, something heavy. He stopped beside Wren. For a moment he didn't speak. He simply stood there close enough for her to feel his presence, but not so close that the proximity felt intrusive. His pale blue eyes, the eyes that had been watching her for 2 years from the corner booth, moved from her face to the dog at her feet, to the tears on her cheeks, and then back to her face again. Then Merle Ashford did something he had not done in the Pinewood Diner in the entire time Wren had worked there. He spoke more than 2 sentences. "I knew," he said quietly. "Not the details, not your name or your call sign or where you served, but I knew." Wren looked at him. The surprise cut through her grief just enough to bring her back to the surface. "First week you worked here," Merle continued. "The way you moved, the way you checked exits, the way your hands never shook even when you were carrying 4 plates on one arm and the diner was packed so tight you couldn't breathe." He paused. "A waitress doesn't move like that. A soldier does." His voice carried no accusation, no judgment, only the bone-deep familiarity of a man describing something he recognized because he had lived it himself. "I was 27 when they sent us to Kuwait," he said. "January 91. 100-hour ground war, they called it later. Made it sound quick. Made it sound clean." His jaw tightened. It wasn't clean. And the 100 hours they counted on the news were not the same 100 hours we lived on the ground. He looked down at the cap in his hand. The faded gold thread of the Desert Storm veteran patch caught the fluorescent light and held it dimly. "I lost my best friend on the 2nd day," he said. "Friendly fire. Wrong coordinates called in by someone who was never in the vehicle that burned." His voice remained steady, but the steadiness had the quality of something maintained by force, like a dam holding back water that was pressing against every seam. "I spent the next 20 years believing I should have seen it coming, should have checked the coordinates myself. Should have done something different. He looked at Ren again. 20 years, he repeated. 20 years of carrying a weight that was never mine to carry. 20 years of hiding inside quiet places where nobody asked questions because the questions I was afraid of weren't the ones other people would ask. They were the ones I asked myself. He turned his cap over in his hand, looking at the faded patch the way a man looks at an old photograph of someone he used to be. I came to this diner every morning for 6 years before you started working here, he said. Same booth, same coffee, same newspaper I don't actually read. I came because this place was quiet and nobody knew me and nobody cared enough to ask why an old man sits in the same corner every morning staring at the same page for half an hour. His voice softened, and then you showed up, and I watched you do the same thing I was doing. Build a wall out of routine, hide inside work the way I hid inside silence. Keep moving so the thing behind you couldn't catch up. He looked around the diner at the faces of the customers who were watching him, and his expression held no anger, only a kind of weary compassion, the compassion of someone who has spent a very long time being alone with the truth and is no longer willing to let someone else endure the same. I should have said something sooner, he said, but I didn't because I told myself I was respecting your privacy, and maybe I was, but maybe I was also afraid that if I opened your door, I'd have to open mine too. He turned back to Ren. The diner was absolutely still. Every customer, every trucker, every man who had refused to give a seat to a disabled veteran that morning was listening to a 61-year-old man in a flannel shirt talk about a war that most of them had only seen on television, and for the first time the distance between that television and this counter felt very small. Merle placed his hand on Ren's shoulder. The touch was light, almost weightless, but it carried 30 years of understanding behind it. You didn't fail, Ren, he said. You survived. And surviving takes its own kind of courage that nobody gives medals for. Ren looked at the old man's hand on her shoulder. She looked at his face, at the lines carved by decades of the same silence she had been carrying for less than half that time. And she saw in his pale blue eyes something she had not seen in any human face since the night in Kandahar. She saw someone who understood. Not because he had read about it or heard about it or imagined what it must be like, because he had lived it. Because he had stood in his own version of the same desert and watched his own version of the same explosion and carried his own version of the same guilt to his own version of the same quiet diner where nobody asked questions. Ren's composure, the last thin wall of it, the final layer that had been holding everything else in place, gave way. She didn't sob. She didn't collapse. She simply lowered her head, pressed her forehead against the edge of the counter, and let herself feel fully and without resistance the 9 years of grief and guilt and exhaustion that she had been carrying alone. Coda pressed against her leg. Merle kept his hand on her shoulder. Coulter sat on the other side of the counter, his own eyes bright with moisture. He didn't bother to hide and let the moment be what it needed to be. The diner waited. It waited the way decent people wait when they recognize they are in the presence of something sacred. Not the sacred of churches and hymns and Sunday mornings, the sacred of ordinary rooms where extraordinary things happen because two people who understand each other's pain finally find themselves in the same place at the same time. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time had lost its reliability inside the Pinewood Diner. The clock on the wall above the register continued to move, but the people beneath it had stepped outside its authority. Ren lifted her head. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a quick, unsentimental motion, the gesture of a woman who was accustomed to pulling herself together in conditions far less forgiving than a roadside diner. She straightened her spine. She took a breath, and she looked at Coulter with eyes that were red and raw, and for the first time since he had met her, completely open. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, ordinary, but the voice that carried them was not the voice of a waitress. It was the voice of a combat medic named Angel 6 who had just learned 9 years too late that the worst night of her life had not ended the way she thought it had. Coulter nodded once. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket. The motion was slow and deliberate. The way everything Coulter did was slow and deliberate. Each movement considered, each gesture carrying precisely the amount of weight it was meant to carry and no more. His fingers disappeared into the pocket and emerged holding a small object wrapped in a piece of dark cloth. He set it on the counter between them. Ren looked at it. The cloth was old, faded to a deep charcoal that might once have been black. It was folded neatly, the corners tucked with the precision of someone who had been taught to fold things correctly and had never unlearned the habit. Something small and hard sat beneath the fabric, creating a slight bulge at the center. Coulter placed his hand on top of the cloth for a moment, as if he were saying goodbye to whatever was inside it. Then he unfolded it. The bronze star medal sat on the dark cloth like a small, heavy truth that had been waiting a very long time to be delivered. The five-pointed star, slightly tarnished by age, caught the light from the fluorescent tubes above the counter and held it with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in a diner that smelled like bacon grease and burnt coffee. Briggs was awarded the Bronze Star posthumously, Coulter said, for his actions that night, for moving those two operators to the extraction point under fire. Wren stared at the medal. She didn't touch it. His family received it at the ceremony, Coulter continued. His mother, his father, his brother Jesse. He paused. Jesse was 19 at the time. He's 28 now. He joined the Marines the year after Briggs died. Finished his service, came home, and spent the last 3 years trying to find someone. Wren looked up from the medal. Jesse asked everyone who was there that night, Coulter said. Every operator, every support element, every crew member on the medevac birds. He wanted to find the medic, the one who stayed behind, the one who gave his brother the 10 minutes that let him save those men. He stopped for a moment, and when he continued, his voice carried the particular roughness of a man talking about someone he cared about. Jesse told me once that his brother called him the night before that mission. Just a regular call. Talked about the dog, talked about the food being terrible, talked about wanting to go fishing when he got home. Normal stuff. Nothing dramatic. But the last thing Briggs said before hanging up was, "The medics in this unit are the bravest people I've ever worked with. They run toward the things that make everyone else run away." Coulter let the words settle. Jesse never forgot that. And after Briggs was killed, that sentence became the reason Jesse spent 3 years looking for Angel 6, because his brother had believed in the person who tried to save him, and Jesse wanted that person to know it. Coulter's voice had grown thick. Not with grief, or not only with grief. With something heavier and more complicated, the sound of a man who had been holding a trust for someone else and was now finally fulfilling the promise he had made. But Angel 6 didn't exist in any record, he said. The file had been erased. No name, no unit assignment, no discharge paperwork. Jesse searched for 3 years and found nothing. The medic who saved his brother's legacy had been turned into a ghost by the same system his brother died serving. The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into a well so deep that nobody heard them hit the bottom. The family talked about it, Coulter said. Briggs's mother and father and Jesse. They talked about who should keep the medal, and they decided. He pushed the cloth and the bronze star across the counter until it rested directly in front of Wren. They decided that the person who gave Owen Briggs the 10 minutes that defined the last act of his life was the person who should have this. Wren looked at the medal, the 5-pointed star, the ribbon, the slight tarnish that came from years of being carried in the pocket of a man who had been looking for someone who didn't officially exist. "I've been carrying it for 2 years, Coulter said. Jesse asked me to, because I was the only one from that night still traveling, still moving from place to place. He thought maybe I'd find her somewhere. He didn't know where. He didn't know how. He just believed that someday, somehow, the right door would open." He looked down at Coda. The dog had finally lifted its head from Wren's knee and was looking up at both of them with an expression that if it had been on a human face, would have been called peace. "I didn't find you," Coulter said. "I walked into this diner because I was hungry and tired, and I needed a place to sit that nobody would give me." A faint smile crossed his face, the first real smile Wren had seen from him. "Coda found you, the way he always found things, the way Briggs trained him to." Wren reached out slowly. Her fingers hovered above the medal for a moment, trembling slightly, as if touching it would make everything real in a way that words alone could not. Then she picked it up. The medal was cool against her palm, heavier than she expected. Or maybe the weight she was feeling was not the weight of bronze and ribbon, but the weight of a story that had been incomplete for 9 years and was now in her hand, finally whole. She closed her fingers around it and pressed it against her chest. She didn't speak. There were no words adequate for what was happening inside her. The guilt she had carried since Kandahar, the belief that she had failed, the conviction that her sacrifice had been meaningless and her punishment had been deserved, all of it was being dismantled by a small piece of metal and the truth it represented. She had not failed. Briggs had not died because of her. He had died doing what soldiers do when the people beside them have given them the chance to act. He had used the time she gave him, and 2 men were alive because of it. The diner was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than it had been an hour ago. Not the uncomfortable silence of people watching something they didn't understand. The respectful silence of people who had just witnessed something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Coulter reached for his crutch. The metal clicked softly against the tile floor as he positioned it under his arm and rose from the stool with the practiced strength of a man who had made this transition 10,000 times and would make it 10,000 more. He straightened his jacket. He placed a $20 bill on the counter beside his empty plate, more than 3 times the cost of the meal. Then he looked at Wren one last time. Angel 6, he said. The call sign hung in the air between them. 2 words, 6 letters. The name of a woman who had walked into a war zone with a medical kit and walked out with a wound that no one could see, and a story that no one had told her the ending of until this morning. Wren looked up at him. The tears were still there, but they had changed. They were no longer the tears of someone drowning in the past. They were the tears of someone surfacing, coming up for air after 9 years underwater. Thank you, she said again. But this time, the words carried something new. Not just gratitude, resolution. The quiet, fierce resolve of a woman who had just learned that the defining act of her life had not been a failure and who was now going to have to figure out what that meant for every day that came after. Coulter nodded. He turned toward the door. Coda stood and moved to his side, falling into step with the crutch the way the dog always did, calibrated and loyal and precise. They reached the door together and Coulter pushed it open with his free hand. Sunlight flooded into the diner. Warm, clean Virginia morning light that smelled like pine trees and cut grass, and the promise of a day that had already become something no one in the room would forget. Coulter paused in the doorway. He didn't turn around. He simply stood there for a moment, framed by the light, a one-legged man and his dog silhouetted against the bright morning like a photograph that someone should have taken, but no one did. Outside through the open door, the Virginia morning was fully awake now. Birds moved between the power lines above the parking lot. A pickup truck idled at the gas station across Route 9, its driver leaning against the hood with a paper cup of gas station coffee, unaware that anything important had happened within 100 yards of where he stood. The world beyond the diner was continuing with the calm indifference that the world always shows toward the private earthquakes happening inside small rooms. But inside the Pinewood diner, the ground had shifted, and everyone who had been standing on it when it moved would remember the feeling for the rest of their lives. Not as a dramatic event, not as the kind of story that makes headlines or trends on social media for a day before being forgotten. As something quieter, something that would surface years later in unexpected moments when they saw a veteran on the street, or heard a helicopter overhead, or noticed a waitress moving with unusual precision behind a counter, and thought just for a second about a Tuesday morning in a roadside diner, when they learned that the people carrying the heaviest burdens are often the ones who carry them in silence. Then he stepped through and the door closed behind him, and the bell above the frame rang one last time. The diner remained still for several seconds after he left. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The bell's echo faded into the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a truck passing on Route 9. And then even those sounds seemed to pause, as if the world outside was granting the people inside one more moment of silence before the ordinary reasserted itself. Then the man in the trucker cap, the one who had been watching from the register through the entire conversation, set his coffee mug down on the counter and cleared his throat. The sound was rough and uncertain, the sound of a man who was not accustomed to speaking in rooms that were listening to him. "I was in the Army," he said. His voice was quiet, directed at no one in particular, and everyone at once. 82nd Airborne, 2 deployments, Iraq. Never saw combat like that, but I saw enough. He paused. He looked at Wren. And I sat at this counter and watched that man walk through this room asking for a seat, and I didn't move. His jaw worked for a moment. That's on me, and I'm sorry. The words hung in the air. Nobody responded. Nobody needed to. The man in the trucker cap picked up his mug, took a long sip, and set it back down. Then he reached into his wallet, left a $10 bill on the counter, and walked out without another word. Others followed. Not all at once, not with speeches or dramatic gestures, but one by one, as customers paid their bills and gathered their jackets and prepared to leave. Something changed in the way they moved past the counter. The father, who had needed the whole table, paused as he walked by and gave Wren a nod. Not the casual nod of a customer thanking a waitress, a slower nod, a heavier one, the kind that carries an apology inside it without needing to say the word. The young man who had slid to the center of his booth stopped at the register, overtipped by $15, and left without making eye contact. Small gestures, inadequate gestures, the kind of gestures people make when they know that what they should have done was act earlier, and what they're doing now is the only thing they have left. Ren stood behind the counter. The bronze star was still in her hand, pressed against her sternum, warm now from the heat of her palm. She looked down at it. Then she looked around the diner at the faces looking back at her. The construction worker who had pulled his chair in. The couple who had avoided eye contact. The father who had said he needed the whole table. The plumber who had lied about waiting for someone. They were all watching her now, and in their eyes she saw something that she had not seen directed at her in 9 years. They saw her, not the waitress. Not the quiet woman with the pulled-down sleeves and the short answers and the polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. They saw the person underneath all of that. The person who had knelt in the sand in Kandahar and held a dying man together with her bare hands and refused to leave when every voice in her ear told her to run. Merle was still standing beside her. His cap was back on his head, the faded desert storm patch facing forward. He gave her shoulder one final squeeze, then released it and stepped back. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked quietly. Ren looked at him. Through the tears and the exhaustion and the weight of everything that had just happened, a small sound escaped her that she didn't recognize at first. It took her a moment to realize it was a laugh, a real one. The first real laugh she had allowed herself in longer than she could remember. "Same time tomorrow," she said. Merle nodded. Then he returned to his corner booth, sat down and opened his newspaper to the page he had been pretending to read all morning. The diner exhaled. Slowly, tentatively, the way a room exhales after a storm has passed, and the people inside are checking to see if the walls are still standing. Forks found their way back to plates. Coffee cups were lifted and sipped. Conversations restarted in low murmurs that gradually climbed back to normal volume. Ren poured herself a cup of coffee. She leaned against the back counter and took a slow sip, holding the mug in both hands the way Coulter had held his. The bronze star sat on the counter beside the register, resting on its dark cloth, catching the light. Hank appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the metal. He looked at Ren. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. "You need a minute?" he asked. Ren shook her head. "I'm good, Hank." He studied her face for a moment. Then he nodded and went back to the grill. But before he turned away, Ren saw something in his expression that she had never seen there before. It was not pity. It was not curiosity. It was respect, the kind that doesn't require words because words would only diminish it. The morning continued. Customers paid their bills and left. New customers arrived and took their seats and ordered coffee and eggs and toast without knowing that anything unusual had happened in this diner today. The clock above the register resumed its authority, ticking forward through the minutes of a Tuesday in Virginia that would eventually fade into the ordinary record of ordinary days. But one thing had changed. When the lunch shift waitress arrived at 11:30, she found Ren standing behind the counter with her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, both arms bare. The thin scar on the inside of her left wrist, visible in the overhead light, no longer hidden, no longer tucked beneath fabric and silence and 9 years of careful concealment. The lunch waitress noticed. She glanced at the scar, then at Ren's face, then back at the scar. She didn't ask about it, but she noticed. And Ren didn't pull her sleeves down. That evening after the diner closed, and the chairs were flipped onto the tables, and Hank had locked the register and turned off the grill, Ren sat in her car in the parking lot. The same parking lot where she had sat every morning for 2 years, gripping the steering wheel and preparing herself to step into a world that didn't know who she was. The bronze star sat on the passenger seat beside her, still resting on its dark cloth. She picked it up and held it in her palm, feeling its weight studying the tarnished surface of the 5-pointed star. Then she opened the glove compartment, took out a small picture frame she had bought at the hardware store on her way to the car, and placed the metal inside it. She would bring it back tomorrow. She would set it on the counter beside the register where the morning light would catch it, and if anyone asked what it was, she would tell them. Not the whole story. Not yet. But enough. Enough to stop pretending she had never been anyone other than a waitress. Enough to stop hiding the scar that proved she had once been brave enough to stand in a place where most people would have run. Enough to let the world see the part of herself she had been burying since the night the sand turned red and the sky turned white, and a man with a dog walked back into the darkness because there were still people who needed saving. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror. The same face she had studied that morning. Brown hair, no makeup, shadows under the eyes. But something was different now. The eyes themselves had changed. Not their color, not their shape. Something behind them. Something that had been locked in a room for 9 years and was now cautiously testing the feel of open air. Ren started the engine. She pulled out of the parking lot and onto Route 9, driving toward the small apartment that had been her hiding place for 2 years. The road was dark. The trees were black outlines against a sky that was just beginning to show the first cold stars of evening. The metal sat on the passenger seat, catching the dashboard light each time she passed under a street lamp. She drove slowly. There was no rush. For the first time in 9 years, she was not running from anything, and she was not yet sure what she was running toward. But the road was open, and the night was quiet, and the weight in her chest had shifted from something that crushed to something that carried. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The next morning, Wren pulled into the Pinewood Diner parking lot at 6:35. She turned off the engine. She looked at the steering wheel. She looked at the diner's front door, where the bell waited to announce her arrival to a room that now knew her name. And for the first time in 9 years, she didn't sit in the car. She picked up the framed metal from the passenger seat, opened the door, and walked across the gravel lot without pausing. Her steps were steady. Her shoulders were straight. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows. The morning air touched the scar on her wrist, and she let it. Inside the diner was already half full. Hank stood behind the register, counting the morning's float. He looked up when the bell rang. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Wren replied. She walked behind the counter, set the framed bronze star beside the register, where the light from the east-facing windows could reach it, and tied her apron. In the corner booth, Merle Ashford looked up from his newspaper. He saw the medal on the counter. He saw Wren's bare forearms. He saw the way she stood, not hiding, not performing, just present fully and without apology in the life she had built and the history she had survived. The old soldier gave a small nod. Then he went back to reading his paper. Wren picked up the coffee pot and started her rounds. The diner was filling up. Truckers, construction crews, regulars. Same faces every week. The breakfast rush was starting, and there was work to do. But this morning, the work felt different. Not easier, not lighter, just different. The way a road feels different when you stop running and start walking. The way a room feels different when you stop hiding in it and start living in it. The way a name feels different when you stop being afraid of it and start letting it be yours. Angel 6. The coffee pot was full. The morning was early, and for the first time in 9 years, Wren Calloway was not trying to forget. She was ready to remember.